Dinner was not a memorable meal, and Lawrence would have struggled to describe what he had eaten if asked. His concentration was lacking, and impatience overrode every other emotion as he waited for the evening to pass. Lawrence wasted an hour walking the streets, and at 10 o'clock returned to his room, making an unsuccessful attempt to sleep on top of the bedclothes. Eventually he gave up and decided it was late enough to risk a visit downstairs. The hallway was empty and the doors to the public areas shut, so he slunk towards the counter and removed the bunch of keys. The back of the Crown was dark and still. Lawrence located the lantern that he had borrowed on his earlier walk and stowed by the rear door. He ignited it and made for the cupboard again, encountering no one this time, feline or human. Once again the cupboard door opened easily, and this time the lantern cast a powerful illumination over the contents of the closet. Lawrence located the Oddfellow's jewels on the middle shelf where he had last seen the symbol. The little pile gleamed in the beam of the lantern as he compared them to the cufflink. He had been right. One of the icons was identical, but something beneath the jewels was different. Propped up against the shelf immediately below was a burlap sack tied with a rough rope that he did not recognize. Lawrence stared at it, trying to remember. But the bag occupied the spot on which he had spilt wax, so it could not have been there the night before. Lawrence untied the rope and pulled out the contents. First he retrieved a dark grey jacket in reasonable condition for a garment of its kind. Then he rummaged inside again and removed a flat cap and a pair of trousers. A halfpenny fell out of the trouser pocket, startling Lawrence as it rolled across the floor. Something white protruded from the other trouser pocket. Inch by inch, he tugged at it until he was holding what looked like a small furry animal. He held it aloft and saw an all-too-familiar wire and spring arrangement. The object he held was a long, full, white beard. Suddenly he realized what he was seeing. The outfit and beard fitted the description that William Miller had given of the man by Moyse's bookstall, the man who had asked him to find the Bible and who was responsible for many deaths, the man who had come perilously close to poisoning Lawrence earlier that day. He dropped the disguise and turned the sack inside out. There, at the bottom, was a bundle of invoices bearing the mark of Aldrich's auctioneers. With shaking hands, Lawrence replaced the clothes and papers in the sack and set off for the police station. Chapter 39. A Mysterious Note. Tuesday, May 28th, 1895. Lawrence whistled as he descended the stairs of the Crown Hotel for the second time that morning. He delivered the burlap sack to the police house late on Monday night, anticipating a lackluster response. Instead, the constable had listened intently. Mr. Gosling, the chemist, had been summoned to the police house shortly after breakfast to give an account of the marsh test conducted the previous day. Then the constable had sent for his inspector, who regarded the sack solemnly, promising to question Harry Aldrich at the earliest opportunity. Lawrence had only given scant details of his suspicions. The facts surrounding the burial club deaths were too disorderly to make public, but he was making progress. As soon as he gained irrefutable proof of financial wrongdoing, he would present the evidence to the authorities. Lawrence decided to spend the rest of the day cross-referencing his records. As he reached the foot of the stairs, the formidable shape of George Panks loomed before him. The worst of his embarrassment about the late-night feeding foray had passed, and Lawrence greeted him with a cheery hello. Panks scowled. "When are you leaving?" he growled. "I haven't decided," said Lawrence, taken aback at the man's tone. George Panks' attitude had changed from the tolerance of a simpleton to outright hostility. "I suggest you decide soon," he said. "You are not welcome here." "Why?" asked Lawrence, perplexed. He wasn't sure he had caused any further offence to his host since the affair with the pie. "The arrest of Harry Aldrich this morning is why. The poor fellow is in the police house because of some cock-and-bull story that you cooked up. Aldrich is a good man, Harpham, and a good customer of this hotel." "So it's about money, is it?" asked Lawrence. "Worried there might not be any more meetings held here? Is that why you risked the life of one of your guests?" "What are you talking about?" "Poison," said Lawrence. "I don't know who you've been speaking to, but I was nearly killed in your hotel yesterday. I've since found incriminating evidence of Harry Aldrich's involvement. So I suggest you consider your position before condemning mine." George Panks continued to glare at Lawrence, but stepped away and allowed him to pass. As Lawrence made for the front door, Minnie Panks breezed past, oblivious to her father's mood. "I've got a letter for you, Mr. Harpham," she said, bustling towards the counter. "I would have delivered it earlier, but Father sent me to the butcher's and I clean forgot. Here." She thrust 2 envelopes towards him. "Ah, a telegram from Violet," he said, looking at the markings on the envelope. "Hello, what's this?" The second envelope was white and written in a chunky, almost childish hand with the words "Private and Confidential" inscribed at the top. Intrigued, Lawrence slipped Violet's telegram into his trouser pocket and slit open the envelope. He read the slip of paper inside. "Come to the reading rooms at the Dis Express as soon as you receive my note." Lawrence turned the page over. The reverse was blank. "Who gave you this?" he said, showing it to Minnie. "Nobody," she replied, not troubling to read the page. "I found it on the doorstep this morning." "When?" "About 7 o'clock. He said vaguely, reaching for the door, not sure what to make of the letter. He supposed that it must have come from young Charles, the compositor. But quite what he wanted with Lawrence was a mystery. If the message had been for Violet, he would have understood. Charles had taken quite a shine to her since her help with his handwriting problems, but the letter was explicitly intended for Lawrence, and therefore a puzzle. Lawrence hastened straight for the printworks, and was there within 10 minutes, hoping it was not another waste of his time. He was keen to get back to his notes and produce a timeline of evidence that might satisfy the constabulary. He pushed the wooden door, but it did not open. Turning the handle did not remedy the problem, and it was clear that the door was locked. Lawrence walked down the side of the building and to the rear, where he remembered seeing another door on his previous visit. Sure enough, he could tell from a distance that the rear door was ajar. He pushed it open and walked inside. The small rear lobby led to the open door of the reading room. Lawrence peered inside, but the room was empty. He went to the front of the building, through the compositor's office and into the entrance with the long counter. The printworks were bafflingly devoid of human life. He returned to the rear again, wondering whether he was being taken for a fool by the letter writer. It could be a punishment for his part in the arrest of Harry Aldrich. After all, Harry was one of the town's most esteemed inhabitants. Lawrence was only too aware of the strength of feeling against him from his earlier encounter with Panks. He returned to the reading room, deciding to use his time wisely by consulting the archived newspapers while the place was empty. But as he glanced across the room, his eye was drawn towards another envelope. It had been propped up against a book in the middle of the table and marked "Private." On the front of the envelope, written in a familiar childish scrawl, was "For the attention of Lawrence Harpham." Chapter 40. Derailed. Monday, May 27th, 1895. The train journey that should have taken Violet no more than 4 hours had begun badly and rapidly turned into the worst travel experience of her life. The steam engine had pulled out of Dis station and gone no more than a few miles before grinding to a halt on the tracks. After a long delay, a harassed conductor informed the passengers that the boiler was faulty and would need repairing. Another hour passed before they were finally underway. The engine limped on a while longer until they reached the outskirts of Norwich. Then disaster struck as an explosion ripped through the front of the train. Time stood still. The windows imploded from the force of the blast, and shards of glass spiked across the forwardmost carriages. Violet joined the other passengers as they scrambled onto the tracks in a disorderly mass. Outside, the scene was chaotic. 2 boilermen, dragged from the front of the train by their colleagues, lay bleeding on the grass. Another man, slumped by the side of the locomotive, was beyond help. The engine lay broken and still, pipes and metal spilling from the front of the boiler. A young mother sobbed frantically, and her frightened children huddled by her side while an elderly lady tried to console them. The woman continued screaming, caught in an unending cycle of hysteria, until a wiry, dark-haired man slapped her on the cheek. "How dare you, sir?" bellowed a white-moustached man in colonial attire. The young man ignored him and shook his head before kneeling by one of the injured boilermen. He cradled the man's head and made a clumsy attempt to dress his wounds, working in silence. The slap had done the trick, and the young woman had stopped crying. She rocked backwards and forwards on a grassy mound, arms cradled around her children. Their sobs quietened as they leaned into their mother. Violet joined the young man and offered her help. He nodded his acceptance, and she explained that she was an experienced first aider. He introduced himself as Morris. One of the fallen boilermen had suffered a deep gash to his upper arm from which blood spurted in a pulsing stream. Violet asked Morris to remove his belt to use as a tourniquet. He unbuckled it without speaking, and Violet applied it to the injured arm. The bleeding slowed to a trickle, and the boilerman's complexion gradually changed from grey to pink. Violet loosened his shirt and made a thorough check. He'd suffered cuts and bruises from the flying metal, but was not in any immediate danger. His companion had been less fortunate. Though initially seeming in better health, he was now flagging. He'd walked from the train unaided, according to Morris, and had appeared uninjured, but now he breathed in rasping gulps, and beads of sweat dotted his brow. Violet felt for his pulse. It was slow. She rested her head on his chest and listened to his rattling lungs. "This man needs urgent medical help," she whispered. "I'll go," said Morris, and he set off towards a hamlet in the distance. Violet was still sitting next to the boiler man an hour later. As dusk had fallen, the temperature dropped. The injured man clung to her hand as his body shivered in shock. Some passengers had taken their chances and made for the hamlet, but Violet remained with the stricken men. She was not alone. The train crew had stayed behind, helping anyone unable to walk, including elderly passengers, a middle-aged man with a walking stick, and 2 young children. Pins and needles spiked through Violet's legs, which she feared would turn to cramp. Just when she thought she would have to get up and walk around to relieve the discomfort, she saw the glow of lanterns in the distance. Moments later, Morris appeared with 2 other men. "Help is coming," he said. "There will be enough carts to take you to Norwich." He was as good as his word, and the transport arrived within moments. The injured went first, and Violet rode with them, staying until they arrived at the hospital. She watched as medical staff assisted them into the emergency wards, wondering what she would do for a bed. But as she walked away, a nurse ran up to her and guided her back into the hospital, where she gave her a thorough examination. Typically, Violet had given no thought to herself. At first, Violet had protested, but realized that she would be less of a nuisance if she agreed. And when the nurse removed her coat, there were swathes of dried blood on her dress. Violet had sustained wounds of her own and not noticed the pain in her bid to aid the more seriously injured. The nurse dressed her cuts and grazes, then offered Violet a bed. Both knew it was not necessary, but Violet would be comfortable on the ward, even if only for a few hours. As it happened, she didn't leave until the next morning. Tuesday, May 28th, 1895. Violet located her luggage at Norwich Station, where her rescuers had left it the previous night. It was still early when she boarded the Cromer train. The trip was quicker and safer than the journey from Dis, and she pulled into the station well before lunchtime, taking her carpet bag while leaving her suitcase in the conductor's care. Violet continued the short trip to Overstrand by carriage as the sun blazed high in the sky on a perfect May day. She walked to the centre of the village, pondering whether to stay or return to Bury on the evening train. Violet strolled down the high street, intending to go to the Cottons' house on Gunton Terrace, but determined to make the most of the balmy weather, she took a detour instead. Turning into the lawns, she walked past the Flint cottages, stopping to peer through an ornate wooden gate where vibrant violet wisteria crowded the wall. The pretty gardens burgeoned with spring flowers. At the end of Paul's Lane, she saw a fisherman crouching by a net at the top of the cliff with a large-eyed needle in his hand. Beside him was a wooden bucket containing seawater in which freshly caught crabs clawed at the surface. A second bucket contained the still bodies of previously boiled crustaceans. Violet asked the fisherman if he would mind her bag, and he nodded his assent. She left it by the side of the buckets, free to explore the beach without the burden of luggage. Violet removed her shoes and stockings and made her way across the sand, avoiding the pebbles. The tide was halfway out, leaving little pools of seaweed and shellfish in its wake. Violet walked to the water's edge, letting the sea lap against her ankles, and inhaled the salty odour. Her senses were alive with the sound and smell of the sea, yesterday's accident already a distant memory. Life was transient, she thought, easily lost. It took an experience like the train explosion to appreciate life and the good health she enjoyed. Violet paddled for 10 minutes, then found a dry spot towards the cliffs and let her feet dry in the sun. Brushing the sand from her toes, she put her shoes on and headed back. By the time Violet climbed to the top, the fisherman had repaired his net and was dressing crabs on a little wooden trestle table. She retrieved her suitcase, and the fisherman suggested she might enjoy a small crab for lunch. Violet accepted gratefully, remembering how much she'd enjoyed them during her stay with Lord and Lady Battersea. She located a nearby seat and began to eat the crab, but a wave of nausea came from nowhere, and she could not finish. Disappointed, Violet left the uneaten crab by the side of the path where seagulls soon disposed of it. With a churning stomach, she returned up Paul's Lane and towards Gunton Terrace. Amelia Cotton was sweeping the pathway outside number 4 when Violet approached. She regarded Violet quizzically before recognition dawned, and she greeted her warmly. They exchanged small talk, and Violet began the tricky task of explaining the purpose of her visit. "So, are you suggesting that my father's Bible belonged to a murderer?" asked Amelia, misunderstanding the Bible's provenance. "No," said Violet. "The man who sold it was the victim. Someone killed him. After my father received the Bible. Yes. A few months later." "But what has it got to do with father?" "Nothing," said Violet. "It is a coincidence. But I have reason to believe that the Bible might contain a document which the murderer went to great lengths to recover." "Father never spoke of any such thing," said Amelia doubtfully. "He may not have understood the significance. Have you kept the Bible?" asked Violet. "I have, as it happens," said Amelia. "Mother gave it to my husband, George, as a keepsake. May I see it? If you wish." Violet followed Amelia into her kitchen and waited at the table while the younger woman went upstairs. She returned with the Bible and set it down on the table, anxiously hovering as Violet opened the front page. The bookstall stamp and inscription were as Violet remembered. She flicked through the pages of the black-bound book, checking for a letter or document, but the Bible was empty. She turned to the final page, checked the binding and pressed the cover. The lining was intact and undisturbed. "I didn't think you would find anything," said Amelia. "If there ever was a letter, it is long gone." Violet put the book on the table, trying not to feel too deflated. She'd known that finding the confession was an unlikely prospect, but one worth checking. "Thank you anyway," said Violet. "It was kind, especially as—" Violet stopped in her tracks as she glanced at the Bible again. There was one place she hadn't yet checked. She stood the book on end and scrutinized the spine. The cover fitted neatly around the pages with no visible gap. Violet splayed it open, and the space between the spine and cover gaped just enough for her to insert the tip of her index finger. She could feel a slight difference in the lining of the spine and dragged her nail along the inside. Something moved, and she tried again, inching an object up the spine until the tip of a curved piece of paper emerged. "What is it?" asked Amelia, eyes wide. Violet pinched the tube of paper and pulled it out, unfurling the document across the table. "Oh, no," she said, colour draining from her face. "It can't be." "Can't be what?" asked Amelia, but Violet was already rushing out of the door. Time was short, and she had an urgent telegram to send before the post office closed. Chapter 41. At Musket Staithe. Lawrence picked up the envelope and examined it. The anonymity of the writing evoked the stomach-churning memories he'd felt when he'd received Catherine's crests. But whatever the envelope contained, it couldn't be that. Nobody from Bury St. Edmunds knew that he was working in Dis. Well, nobody apart from his domestic, Annie, who he trusted implicitly. There were no further clues on the back of the envelope, and he opened it gingerly, revealing a newspaper cutting dated December 8th, 1877. The clipping was from the Bury Free Press and detailed Fanny Nunn's inquest. The article was familiar. Lawrence had already seen it during his research, but the snippet in his hand was a fraction of the original piece, and someone had underlined a paragraph in blue ink. It read, "There's £30 of money in this little bag. You will find it in my ulster coat pocket tomorrow morning 20 yards from Mr. Musket Staithe in the mere under the weeping willow." Carefully written beneath in the same childish writing as the original note was the figure 9. It was drawn next to a depiction of a clock face with a half-moon scribbled below. Lawrence sighed as he leaned against the table with the note in his hand. The whole thing left him feeling like a participant in a parlour game. The picture was an unsubtle clue to time, and the presence of the moon indicated that he should be somewhere at 9 o'clock at night. Judging by the reference to Mr. Musket Staithe, it was an instruction to meet underneath the willow tree at the appointed hour. But it was silly and dramatic, like a theatre performance, and not a very good one at that. Lawrence felt too old to participate in a purposeless charade, and yet he was still curious. What might he find there? And would it be a risk if he didn't arrive at the requested hour? He mulled it over for another 10 minutes, vacillating between obeying instructions or ignoring the note. If he decided to go, should he take a companion or set off alone? He even contemplated asking for Michael's opinion, but the long walk to Friends' Church deterred him, not to mention the embarrassment of Michael knowing he had given credence to the note. In the end, curiosity got the better of reason, and he decided to go by himself. The risks were low. It would still be light at 9 o'clock, and he had no cause for concern about his safety now that Harry Aldrich was in police custody. Making the decision made him feel more comfortable, and he left the printworks for the Crown Hotel. Once there, he spent the rest of the day arranging records. Satisfied with his progress and confident that he could prove his suspicions, he broke for supper. Then, finding it unusually quiet, he read the paper in the lounge until 9:15. Earlier that day, it had occurred to Lawrence that he had no idea where to find Mr. Musket Staithe. As usual, he broached the subject with Minnie Panks, and obligingly she not only shared the location but told him what a staithe was, without him having to go through the indignity of asking. Feeling better prepared, Lawrence set off towards the mere, looking out for a large willow tree near to Musket's landing stage. He saw it as soon as he approached the mere, and as Lawrence drew closer, it was apparent that the rickety structure required repair. Lawrence loitered beneath the willow and ran a hand over its ancient bark. Shrouded within its golden-leaved boughs, he realized that he was almost invisible to anyone passing. Whoever had summoned him here must have understood the cloaking effect of the willow, and thus hoped for privacy. The thought made Lawrence nervous, and he walked towards the water's edge and picked up a small rock, which he placed in his pocket for protection. 9 o'clock came and went, and nobody appeared, and at 5 minutes past the hour, Lawrence wandered away from the mere. As he reached the footpath, he almost collided with Joseph Pope, Arthur Thompson, and George Fairweather.
"Good evening," said Joseph. "Which of us are you arranging to arrest today?"
It wasn't like that, sighed Lawrence. He hadn't expected anyone to welcome him with open arms, but the overt hostility came as a surprise. George Fairweather glared at him.
"I'm going," he growled. "The air smells bad around here."
He stalked off without looking back. Joseph Pope tipped his hat and forced a smile.
"Enjoy the rest of your evening," he said sarcastically. "Are you joining me, Arthur?"
"Later," said Arthur, holding his hand up. He waited until the men were distant shadows. "Sorry," he shrugged. "They are still upset about Harry." "But you're not?" asked Lawrence. "Only because I'm sure that he will soon be a free man. I don't hold you entirely responsible," he continued. "Are the fish biting well?" "I beg your pardon?" "It's 9:10 and getting dark," he said, snapping open his pocket watch. "Why else would you be by the mere?" His question caught Lawrence off guard. "I'm waiting for someone," he said without thinking. "I'll keep you company if you like." "No." Lawrence immediately regretted the force of his refusal and the suspicion it might generate. "Are you sure?" "Quite sure." "Pity," said Arthur. "I've nothing better to do." Lawrence watched him stride away, waiting until he was sure that he was alone. Then he returned to his place beneath the willow, deciding to wait for another half an hour before giving it up as a bad job. A slight breeze rustled through the leaves as he stood in semi-darkness, concealed from the sight of any passer-by. Gently lapping water punctuated the silence, and Lawrence shifted his weight from one leg to the other as the evening cooled. A branch snapped underfoot as Lawrence eased towards the edge of the willow, then another, until enlightenment dawned. Lawrence was standing on grass. So why could he hear footsteps? The sound was coming from someone else. He tensed, barely breathing, listening for a clue to the direction of the noise. But the only sound was the high-pitched yowl of a passing fox. He must be hearing things. The failing light was making him nervous, and he was getting cold. He decided to give it another 5 minutes, then retreat to the Crown for a quick bedtime brandy. His mouth watered at the thought. Lawrence pulled his collar up and thrust his hands into his pockets, his fingers connected with Violet's telegram, discarded earlier in his haste to identify the letter-writer. He retrieved it and opened the envelope, straining to read in the poor light. It was no good. The words swam in a blurry mess on the page. He patted his inner pocket and found the tin he always carried containing a candle stub and matches. Then he struck a match, lit the candle, and examined the telegram. It was a brief and concise warning. And as the words registered in his mind, Lawrence heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps behind him. He had no time to draw breath, let alone move, before he felt the cold metal edge of a knife against his neck. Chapter 42. Unmasked.
"I wouldn't move if I were you,"
said a familiar voice as the sharp-bladed weapon pressed into his carotid artery.
"I wasn't planning to," Lawrence retorted. "I suppose you recognize my voice."
"Yes, it's quite distinctive." "Are you going to tell me the point of this charade?" Lawrence winced as the knife dug deeper, and he felt a drop of blood well against the blade and trickle down his neck. "Careful. This waistcoat is new."
"Then I would say that you wasted your money,"
said his assailant, chuckling at the play on words. "Are you going to tell me why we are here?"
"If that's how you want to spend the last few minutes of your life, then by all means. What would you like to know?"
"Let's start with Amy Sullivan, shall we? What was she to you?"
"Amy Sullivan."
The man sighed wistfully as he drawled her name in elongated vowels.
"What a woman."
"But you never married her."
"Why would I? I didn't love her."
"Yet she loved you."
"You probably find that difficult to understand. I was a handsome young buck in my day. Amy's adoration was useful. But I didn't need a wife. I needed a partner."
"Partner in crime?"
"Precisely."
"And it was all about money."
"Now, Harpham, that's rather offensive. The money was a useful extra, but it was all about power."
Lawrence snorted. "Power!" he exclaimed, momentarily forgetting the knife against his throat. "You killed women and children. They were easy targets."
"Not power in the crude way you describe. And I killed full-grown men, too. It was about possessing the power of life or death."
Lawrence shuddered at the excitement in his captor's voice, betraying naked passion at the thought of murder.
"Have you ever seen anyone drown?"
The man closed his eyes, as if accessing a favorite memory.
"The pleasure of watching is exquisite. But nothing surpasses the act. I can make the end quick, or prolong it indefinitely. The power, the thrill."
"But why?"
"Because I like it."
"And Fanny Nunn? Was she just another victim?" asked Lawrence, discreetly sliding his hands in his pockets.
"Fanny Nunn was an interfering busybody," hissed the man, always poking her nose into matters that did not concern her.
"Tell me more." The man expelled a sigh, and Lawrence recoiled at the warm breath as it brushed the back of his neck.
"Sit down,"
the man commanded. Lawrence lowered himself to a seated position beneath the willow and looked up at his assailant. "Won't you join me?" he asked.
"Hardly,"
said the man, running his thumb along the edge of the knife.
"Move so much as a finger, and I will cut your tongue out. Stay still, and I'll tell you a story."
Lawrence sat quietly and waited for the man to begin.
"My mother killed my father," said Joseph Pope casually. "And I was quite happy to go along with it. We were poor, you see, had nothing. Father was sick and didn't work. He was a useless waster. I was 16 when Father died. Mother and I discussed it first, both agreeing that my meagre income could support 2 of us, but not 3. Father was 10 years older than she, and as weak as a kitten by the time we killed him. He didn't struggle when she put the pillow over his head. Nobody questioned his death, nobody cared. And then we remembered that he had been paying into the burial club. Not only did my earnings go further, but we received a little more than the cost of the funeral. It was a good Christmas that year. For once, there was food on the table."
Joseph paced as he spoke, keeping a watchful eye above Lawrence's head.
"The following year, Mother had a fall. She lingered for a week, then died. A terrible accident, they said. It wasn't anything of the kind. I pushed her down the stairs. Fortunately, she never regained consciousness. Waiting until 13 months after Father's death gave me time to pay a year's worth of insurance premiums on her life. It was a much better return on investment than the pitiful offerings of the burial club. Then I met Amy."
"How?"
"She nursed my mother in her final weeks," said Joseph. "Amy was lonely and liked to talk, which was irritating to begin with, until I realized how useful her village tittle-tattle could be." One day she told me that Hannah Rampling had been complaining about her sick child, wishing that it would die so she could have the burial club money. Amy deplored her sentiments, but all I could see was the flaw in her logic. Hannah Rampling wouldn't get the money, you see. Children under 8 are uninsurable. But it put me in mind of a scheme for use outside the confines of the burial club payments, so I insured the life of a sick child. I had no relationship with the boy. He belonged to one of the parishioners, but the insurer accepted me as the parent, and I waited for him to die. The child had a wasting disease and did not take long to succumb. The insurers asked a few questions, and I profited handsomely. But Amy discovered the insurance papers and started to pry. "I'm surprised you didn't kill her too," said Lawrence, staring at Pope from his seated position. Joseph's lip curled. "Why would I kill her when she could be useful? No. I courted her and made love to her until she became devoted to me. I gave her little gifts from my profits. She did not mind the deception when it only amounted to fraud. But that did not last. No, there are only so many times one can fool an insurance company. In any case, sickness is unreliable. Illness does not always lead to death, and when it does, the timing may not work. As it happened, a solution arrived, courtesy of Amy, who had been speaking to Hannah Rampling again. Hannah had too many children to feed and wasn't attached to any of them. I asked Amy to suggest to her that the demise of one might be to the advantage of the rest. At first, Amy balked at the scheme, so I withdrew my affections. Within a week, she'd come crawling back, prepared to do my bidding. Amy agreed to act as my agent in the strictest confidence, never revealing my involvement, and under my guidance, she encouraged Hannah to invest a little money into the burial club. 9 months later, she had paid enough to guarantee death benefits, and we set to work on the second part of the plan, which was the death of one of her children, of course. She chose one of her sons. He was not a pleasant child, though it would not have mattered if he was, but Billy Rampling was particularly obnoxious. He was rude, foul-mouthed, and the sort of boy who pulled wings off flies for fun. His mother sent him down to the river on Amy's instructions, and I killed him there. His death was the first at my hands since Mother, and the most satisfying. Nothing has ever compared to the thrill of holding him under the water and watching the air bubbles disperse, the shudder of his final breath, the moment that life became extinct. The power of it, Harpham, the sheer, unadulterated power. "Steady on," said Lawrence sarcastically. Pope frowned at the interruption to his recollections. "You will soon find out what it's like to be on the other end of that power," he snapped. "Now, where was I? Oh, yes. The Rampling child. I left him in the river, and they found him later that day. The surgeon examined him and declared him drowned. His mother had the burial club money, as planned, with a bit for me and a bit for Amy. And that's how it began, a combination of insurance and burial club frauds. Sometimes with the cooperation of the parent or the spouse, and sometimes on my own initiative. It has been very lucrative, Harpham." "And nobody ever knew?" "No. Amy was a nurse with easy access to the weak and vulnerable, none of whom knew about me. Well, not until that interfering creature Fanny Nunn stuck her nose in." "So she was blackmailing you?" Had he not been in fear of his life, Lawrence would have relished the thought. He and Violet had guessed as much. "I was discussing a proposition with Amy one day which Fanny Nunn overheard," said Joseph. "Fortunately, I was standing in the lee of the building and she could not see me. She heard the conversation and saw Amy, but didn't understand the consequences of what she had witnessed at the time. Later they found old man Good in the hay barn with his head smashed in, and she remembered the conversation and understood our intentions. His death was not an accident, then? Quite the contrary. I fully intended to smother Good, but he fell from the hayloft and hit his head on the stone step. It looked exactly like an accident to anyone except Fanny Nunn, who had heard us discussing Good earlier. Luckily, she was greedy and resorted to blackmail instead of telling the authorities. She visited Amy and asked for £30. We could easily have spared it, but she would have always been there, waiting for another opportunity to make money. She had to go. Amy summoned her to the staith to collect her ill-gotten gains, and I tossed her into the mere, knowing that she could not swim. Nobody saw you? Not a soul. It has always been that way. Nobody knew of my involvement. Nobody even guessed that the deaths were anything other than natural. I am just Joseph, large and jovial, a friend to all. Even if the good people of Dis knew there was a murderer in their midst, I am the last person they would suspect, which is why I won't get caught when I kill you. What makes you think I haven't told someone where to find me? I made you wait, didn't I? There was a reason for that. Passing with Fairweather and Thompson allowed me to watch you. Of course, I didn't expect you to leave your position under the willow. I picked it precisely to hide you from view. And the quick chat established that nobody else was nearby. I caught up with Fairweather, waited for Thompson, and entered my house while they watched before doubling back. All in 10 minutes. And leaving me with an excellent alibi. Tell me about Moyes, said Lawrence, ignoring the glee in Joseph Pope's voice. Ah, yes. A far greater problem than Fanny Nunn, it turned out, but Providence has always smiled upon me. Moyes had a secret. A secret that did not endear him to his brother-in-law. I don't even know what it was, but it didn't matter. William Jackson was intolerant of anything that Moyes had to say. He received a letter about Amy's blasted confession to which he cannot have attached any credence. I know this because he screwed it up in a ball which fortuitously dropped to the floor of the Crown Hotel as I was passing. I shudder to think what would have happened if it had fallen into the wrong hands. I needed to act quickly. And you went to Liverpool? I did, but not on impulse. I pondered the matter overnight, weighing up the risk and considering if there was an alternative course of action. There was none. The man was a danger, and disposal of the confession was essential. So you went to Liverpool in disguise. As you found out, it was quite a shock when I realized that you knew. I don't recall talking about it. You didn't. I found a journal in your room. I was always going to introduce arsenic into your water, but the act gave me even greater pleasure once I read through your notes and realized the extent of your knowledge. You had accumulated an alarming amount of information, including reference to my disguise. How did you do it? Do what? Doctor my water with arsenic. It's necessary to sign a poison register, and even then, chemists colour the poison. There was the barest trace of sediment in the glass. I nearly missed it. The arsenic came from an old tin of rat poison, said Joseph Pope. It has been in my possession for many years, and is as effective now as it ever was. I use it sparingly, though, he continued. Varied murders are less likely to look suspicious. Returning to Moyes, said Lawrence, I don't understand why he died. Neither do I, to be frank. In hindsight, it was the perfect solution to my problem, but I did not set off to harm Moyes. There was no danger to me without Amy's confession. Nobody knew who had written it. It was clear that she had not named me, and if she had signed it, it would have been evident in the letter that Jackson received. But I did not know if there were any other means of identification within the confession, and if Moyes returned to Dis one day with the letter, there was a chance that someone might recognize the handwriting. My sole intention was to locate the letter and destroy it, and I employed Miller for that purpose. How he made such a meal of it, I cannot imagine. Frustration and panic, said Lawrence. He could not locate the confession nor the Bible in which it lay. He didn't look hard enough. Moyes kept his book stock at his dwelling. I questioned one of his boys. You overlooked one thing, though. What? He ran a bookstall, the sole purpose of which was to make money, and he'd sold the Bible. It wasn't there to find. I don't believe it, Joseph Pope spluttered with incredulity. Why would he sell the very book that contained the confession he was so disturbed about finding? I doubt very much that he did. Books littered his house, and he employed several assistants at the bookstall, all of whom had access. He may not have even been aware that it was missing. How do you know? Joseph spat the words angrily. Lawrence considered his reply. Joseph Pope was a cold-blooded, conscienceless killer from whom he would be lucky to escape. If he said too much, it might implicate Violet, and if he saw the telegram in his pocket, it would cement her fate. You'll never know, he said coldly with a recalcitrant expression on his face. Tell me. Pope knelt behind Lawrence and pulled his head back by his hair, tracing the blade of his knife down Lawrence's thorax. Lawrence clenched his fists, trying to prevent his body from shaking too hard. Sweat ran in rivulets down his temples. He was starting to panic about his weak position and vulnerability to the whims of a multiple murderer. I said, tell me, hissed Pope, or I will cut you. He moved the knife up to Lawrence's face and placed the tip at the top of his cheek. An eye or your tongue? He asked. Choose. Lawrence slowly unclenched his right fist as another drop of sweat trickled from his brow. His hand moved undetected towards his coat pocket. Eye or tongue? Eye or tongue? Said Pope in a sing-song voice as he moved the knife from cheek to lip, all the time pulling Lawrence's hair tighter with his free hand. Oops! Slipped, said Pope, as the knife cut the skin between Lawrence's lip and nose. A trickle of blood seeped into his mouth. Lawrence licked his lips, feeling sick at the metallic taste. But it focused his mind. Lawrence Pope was going to kill him, and if he didn't act soon, it would be too late. In one swift move, he plunged his hand into his coat pocket, grabbed the rock he had collected earlier, and thrust his hand behind his shoulder, connecting with Pope's jawbone. Pope howled in pain and dropped the knife. Lawrence rolled to one side, searching for Pope in the shadows as he scrambled to his feet. Daylight was long gone, but he could see the dim outline of Pope a few yards ahead of him. The portly killer was on one knee, clutching his head. A twig snapped as Lawrence moved forward, and Pope jerked his head up, piggy eyes meeting Lawrence's stare. He snatched at something on the ground before him, and Lawrence held back, realizing that Pope had located the fallen knife. Joseph Pope got unsteadily to his feet, holding the blade in front. He waved it towards Lawrence. "Don't be a fool," snarled Lawrence. "I can outrun you. Put the knife down." "All right," said Pope, placing the knife on the ground directly in front. "Step away," commanded Lawrence. Pope took one pace backwards and waited. Lawrence moved forwards uncertainly, suspicious at the speed of Pope's capitulation. But Pope was a safe distance away, and Lawrence knew he had time to swoop for the knife, even if the killer came at him. But as Lawrence knelt and reached out, he felt a crack against his temple and dropped to his knees. The last thing he saw before the world went black was the same bloodied rock he'd used on Pope a few minutes before. Chapter 43. Submerged. Lawrence woke to the sound of grunting as a noise like a truffle pig disturbed his slumber. His face was wet and cold, and a searing pain shot through his head. He shivered, wondering whether he was in the grip of a nightmare. Then the grunting started again, and he felt something brush against his face, something like grass. He inhaled a mossy smell,
and realized that he was close to the ground and his body was moving. Rough hands clutched his ankles, dragging him onto a muddy path as his arms followed uselessly behind. He coughed and inhaled a mouthful of dirt, then twisted his head to orientate himself. A pale moon hung high in the sky, illuminating a body of water to the front. It was the mere. He was inches from the riverbank. The grunting stopped, and his feet were released as a shape loomed ahead, kicking him over to face the night sky. Joseph Pope stood above him, brandishing the knife.
"Ah, you're awake. Good,"
said Pope, a cruel smile etched across his face.
"I would hate you to miss your death."
Lawrence planted his hands behind him and tried to heave himself up.
"No, you don't,"
hissed Pope.
"Not this time."
He took the knife and plunged it into Lawrence's forearm. Lawrence felt strangely detached from the scream that exploded from his chest, piercing the silent night. Pulling himself together, he sat up and lunged towards Pope with his uninjured arm. Pope grimaced, then aimed a boot at Lawrence, connecting with his stomach. Lawrence flailed, trying to catch his breath, but it wouldn't come. Gasping like a landed trout, he gulped at the air, but it was futile. Lawrence lay, winded, the air kicked from his lungs as Pope grabbed his ankles again, pulling him towards the water. As they reached the edge of the mere, Pope stepped to one side, kicked Lawrence until he lay horizontally along the bank, then rolled him into the water. As Lawrence felt the freezing liquid seep through his suit, he raised his head in shock and took a deep breath, finally inflating his lungs. But Pope was waiting. Standing on the edge, he raised his boot and slammed it onto Lawrence's skull. Lawrence thrashed beneath the water as Pope ground his face into the gravelly bottom. Sediment streamed down his throat and into his eyes, and his lungs screamed for air. He shook his head, but the water sapped his strength, and he could not escape Pope's hobnailed boot. He felt a bubble escape from his lips, then another. It was all over. He couldn't hang on. Just as the blackness began to overwhelm him, his head seemed to float weightlessly to the surface. The boot was gone. A pair of arms pulled him from the mere and dragged him to safety.
"Hold on, Harpham," said a voice.
Lawrence stared through blurry eyes. Suddenly, multiple lanterns illuminated the edge of the mere.
"Out of the way!"
Another man continued, pushing him to a seated position and slapping his back. He coughed as a lungful of water sloshed from his mouth.
"Here,"
said a man he didn't recognize, covering him with a blanket.
"What happened?"
Lawrence croaked, recovering his faculties.
"I heard you cry out," said a familiar voice. "I wasn't about to let you suffer the same fate as Fanny Nunn."
Lawrence looked up into the concerned eyes of Harry Aldrich.
"They've let you go?"
Aldrich nodded.
"Pope left evidence in your shop, I suppose?"
"I expect so."
"Where is he?"
Lawrence looked around in alarm. "There." Harry Aldrich pointed to an object in the mere that looked like a floating log.
"Is he dead?"
Aldrich nodded. "I heard you cry out. Opened my window and saw you in the mere, just like I saw Fanny all those years ago. But I wasn't going to let the same thing happen again. I roused my neighbours, and we ran down to the water. Pope was standing there with a maniacal expression on his face. We pulled him off, but he ran towards Musket Staithe. The steps were rotten. He fell and hit his head on a post. Pope is dead, Mr. Harpham. Drowned. It is all over." Chapter 44. No Reprieve. Tuesday, June 4th, 1895. A clock ticked loudly in the premises of Harpham and Smith Private Investigators in Bury St. Edmunds. The occupants of the room stared wordlessly at the timepiece, barely breathing. They watched as the second hand circumvented the clock face twice, and both jumped when the clock chimed the hour. "That's it then," said Lawrence Harpham, turning towards his companion, who occupied the desk to his side. Violet nodded. I thought William Miller might get reprieved. I didn't, said Lawrence. Uncle Fred sent a telegram yesterday. He was not expecting leniency. Do you think Miller saw his family before he died? I should think so, said Lawrence, looking at the clock again. It's usually the way. Lawrence and Violet were in their office half an hour earlier than usual. Each had decided, without conferring, that they would mark the hour of William Miller's execution at their desks. On any less sombre occasion, seeing Violet for a few extra minutes would have pleased Lawrence no end. She had not been herself lately, disappearing at odd hours and looking sickly and pale. On several occasions she had started to say something and stopped herself mid-flow. Recently they had spoken of little other than work-related matters, and he was beginning to think that he might have offended her. Yet Violet was still a source of considerable strength to him, especially the day before when another anonymous envelope had arrived. They both saw it at the same time, but Violet had snatched it from the doormat and set light to it, dropping the burning remains in the empty fireplace. Lawrence had protested, desperate to know what was under the sealed flap, but Violet had gently told him that it was the only way to save his sanity, and she'd been right. The letter had not blackened his mood, nor opened tender wounds. Catherine occupied a more modest part of his feelings, commensurate with her absence from his life. Violet, on the other hand, was beginning to take up an increasing number of his thoughts. His concern over her recent demeanour and insularity had caused him to request that she join him in the Abbey grounds at lunchtime. It was time he acknowledged her importance, and showed her how much he cared. Perhaps then she would feel able to confide in him. "Did you get the letters?" he asked, breaking from his reverie. Violet nodded. "They arrived last night. Please thank your uncle." "I will. Did you find anything worthwhile?" "Oh, yes, take a look at this." Violet handed Lawrence a long blue envelope affixed with a New Zealand postage stamp. Uncle Fred, an avid reader of the Liverpool Mercury, had seen notice of an auction to sell the effects of the late Edward Moyes. His nephew had kept most of his personal items, but Uncle Fred had purchased a small cabinet, inside which was a bundle of letters tied with string. "I've seen this before," said Lawrence, slipping one of the letters from the envelope. "I recognize the name." He pointed to the neat signature at the bottom of the document. "James Dunleavy wrote the majority of the letters," said Violet. "They confirm what I suspected." Lawrence reread the message and felt none the wiser by the time he reached the end. "He says he has had a successful trip and will return home within the month," said Lawrence. "He trusts that Moyes is well and hopes that he is not lonely. The content is trivial." Violet passed him another letter. "Try this one." "Much of the same," said Lawrence. "Idle chatter. Don't you find it rather intimate?" Lawrence knitted his brow as he scrutinized the pages. "It is somewhat," he conceded. "Perhaps Dunleavy was a relative." Violet raised her eyebrow half an inch. "You're not suggesting—" She passed him another envelope, this time white and square. The Scole address was typewritten, and the letter inside bore the date, 1887. The formally written missive contained a thinly veiled warning from the Hobart branch of the Plymouth Brethren. Moyes should not approach the Norfolk Brethren sects, who were now aware of his behaviour. The letter referenced a scandalous relationship and Moyes's subsequent voyage back to Blighty. Lawrence squirmed in his chair. "I see," he managed. "You see? Is that all? Why are you not angry at their treatment of him?" Violet demanded. "That poor man, he cannot help his feelings or choose who he loves. They destroyed his life when they banished him from New Zealand. Look through the rest of the letters when you get a chance," she continued. "Before the incident, Moyes was a highly regarded evangelist. He made huge personal sacrifices to spread God's word. But not content to expel him from the Antipodes, these so-called men of God conspired to ruin his life in England." So the stranger who approached William Jackson was from New Zealand, or Tasmania. It could have been either, but yes, that is my best guess. William Jackson could not bear what his brother-in-law was and sent him away. Poor Edward went to Liverpool, where nobody knew him, in the hope of privacy, so he could continue his life without scandal. Only to be murdered. Lawrence steepled his hands and considered the transience of life. "We should make the most of every moment," he said, gazing towards Violet. She was unjudgmental and compassionate. What more could a man want in a partner? "We need to talk," he said, voice brimming with emotion. As Violet opened her mouth to speak, the doorbell jangled, and an elegant young lady closed her parasol and came into the room. Lawrence turned hot and cold as he met Loveday's eyes. "Are you pleased to see me?" she gushed. "We had such a lovely time in Liverpool that I thought I would look you up." Violet stared at Loveday open-mouthed, closing her eyes as if in pain. Swallowing hard, she got to her feet, cleared the letters from Lawrence's desk, and stowed them in her drawer. Nodding silently at Loveday, Violet left the office with her head bowed. Lawrence watched in stunned silence as she disappeared from the butter market and made her way towards the railway station. Author's note: The Skull Confession combines the real-life murder of Edward Moyes in Liverpool with the unsolved drowning of Fanny Nunn in Diss. Edward Moyes is a real person and was an evangelist in Tasmania. He returned to England after becoming the subject of a scandalous relationship. As usual, many characters in The Skull Confession existed. Some are creations of the author's imagination. You've been listening to The Skull Confession by Jacqueline Beard, narrated by Andrew Cullum, published by Whole Story Quest Audiobooks, an imprint of W.F. Howes Limited. This work is copyrighted 2020 Jacqueline Beard. This recording is copyrighted 2020 W.F. Howes Limited.